places where cartoonists can hone their craft.
Anthologies were huge for me, like for seeing like what was possible and like seeing like just the huge variety of stuff
that was exciting in and of itself. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Like 00, Instant Piano, like
Instant Piano, those guys all had per group in an anthology.
That is true. But yeah, 00.
Raw, even heavy metal. Like I remember, I read Jim Woodring in heavy metal before I saw his work anywhere else. It was mostly robot tits, but like there was definitely whoever was.
For Richard Corbin with his hot caveman jerk-off material. Oh my goodness gracious.
Oh man, Richard Corbin was really fucking universal. I reread Rat God recently, and the like relish that he displays when rendering male abs is like so apparent.
Yeah,
but there's a lot of great tits in that book too. It's just something for everybody. He's all things to all people.
So craft. So where do you feel like your own work lies in this? Because I would say for me, I'm never going to be a craft person, like visually at least. Like I don't have the chops. Like, I mean, I can, you both were saying nice things about this most recent story I did for Theater of Terror. I appreciate it. But it's never going to be easy or natural for me. But I'm never going to reach a Howard Cruz level. Like, it's just never going to happen. On the other hand, I think I'm a good storyteller, and the stories I want to tell are, I hope, are interesting and kind of unique in some way. I have better chops as a writer. I have kind of interesting things to say, hopefully. But I'm never going to have the kind of craft you're talking about. And I look at, like, and especially the great masters, I look at, I have all these books of, like, Alex Toth, and, I mean, all these people who, like, I'm just never going to get a Wally Wood. I'm never going to, there's no way.
There was definitely a time where I put Wally Wood on a very high pedestal, and I still do. I think he's great. But I also have a thing for cartoonists that killed themselves. I think that a lot of that stuff is like, Toth is a good example of, like, somebody that really honed it in a storytelling perspective, but I'm talking about craft in the broadest sense, where it permeates every level of the work and sort of takes the craft of comics, should treat comics as like a whole unto itself. Yeah. Not like a bunch of little disciplines, but one discipline that like encompasses design, draftsmanship, visual storytelling.
Well, like, it's a bastard art form.
Yeah.
It brings in all these other elements.
It's hybrid.
So I think
I can't make all the craft, especially visually, but I'm really good at editing it and seeing if it's working and giving advice on how to make it better. Like doing this last book, when I had more kind of like, because with No Straight Lines and some of the other stuff I've done, I just collect the material that's already there. Theater of Terror, I had people make me work, and I had my hands in it. Like I did editorial advice on all of it, and like it was really fun. I get to be the kind of like, the little puppet master.
The producer.
The producer, and be like, okay, this is a great page. Your lettering is off, right? Like you rearrange the lettering to make this more readable. Like, and I do that with my students. I love that shit. Like that's the kind of thing where craft for me works best, when I can be an editor and not the creator.
I think that's something that's missing from a lot of alternative comics. That
editors benefit for sure.
That like clearly so much of what to this day, so much of what like Fantagraphics and D&Q publish are just the creator's undiluted vision, you know. And I'm assuming somewhere along the way somebody corrects the typos,
right?
But nobody says like these 20 pages need to be completely rewritten the way they would if you were publishing a book through like Random House or something.
Right. Blanket should have been,
Blanket should have been 150 pages tops.
Right. Yeah.
but that was
gorgeous,
way nicer than what I thought you were going to say about blankets.
I've vented
you made your peace with blankets.
Craig's a nice guy.
Yes, he is, and incredibly talented. And even those pages that shouldn't be there, they're beautiful. So, but yeah, I mean that's the problem with not having an editor. But being an editor is a difficult task.
What was the biggest editorial pushback that you had to make when you were putting together Theater of Terror? The thing that would take the most work that you asked a cartoonist to do?
That was the first story that came in. So I was all excited to be like a really hands-on editor for this book. And so the first story that came in from a former student of mine, I was like, hey, do you mind if I like really like go to town with, and she was like,
really this.
And she was like, sure, whatever. And then I essentially rewrote it. Terrible thing to do. It was like absolutely awful.
Well,
As soon as I sent it to her, her first reaction was like, "Oh wow, this is a lot," and I was like, "Oh my god, what did I do? Fuck! I wasn't being an editor. I was rewriting the whole fucking thing and asking her to draw it, basically, and it was just, it was this act of hubris and like I fucked it up, And she, I apologized profusely. She was, incredibly gracious about it. The work that came out was, I think, she took the ideas that I had, some of the ideas that I had come up with, and she incorporated them nicely into into her original concept, and it ended up being a stronger piece. But like, wow, I really screwed that one up. So that made me kind of like, all right, there's a gray zone here where I need to shoot for, or not gray zone, it's just the right zone, right? Yeah. As an editor, you don't rewrite something.
Theater of Terror is an anthology of gay horror comics, queer horror comics. And you are curating other people's work, which is different than No Straight Lines, where you were acting in more a historian capacity.
Yeah, as a historian. So I wrote an essay about the history of queer comics, and then I basically plucked stories from, I just did a lot of research and found different, everything from like, early gay gag strips from magazines, early queer newspapers and magazines, to like underground comics, and found some gems there, dyke punk scenes, early trans, comics, and like all this stuff, like, and I just kind of plucked stuff. And so I was looking for artistic merit, historical merit, and representational merit. Those were my three categories. So it was very difficult to do in the sense that there was like, there'd be like big long pieces that I couldn't excerpt, and they were important, but I just couldn't get an excerpt out of it that would work. So I had to kind of leave those aside. And then there was, so there was a lot of like juggling I had to do, and then other things that would be like, okay, well, I need to get something from this perspective, but I can't find the right work for it. So it was difficult, but it was about being a historian and a researcher as opposed to being an editor, in the same way of like, I wasn't changing the work.
As that was going on, was there any talk was Fantagraphics published that, right? Was there any talk about, for the work that could not be properly represented with an excerpt, was there any talk about maybe like an extensive reissue campaign, or a reprinting campaign? Sorry, I collect records.
I think it's a great idea, because going back to like your experiences at SPX, like that's like one of those things where it's like,
oh right,
how on earth do these kids know their history? Because is it out there? I mean, it's out there in your book, but like in the greater sense of like how you can go back and like look at the stuff that Alan Lomax collected and like,
right,
and
that's
like
a really
dip
good
into
point.
Ryko like reissues from the late 80s, early 90s. Like there's not something like that for like black comics or queer comics or like that's actually I hadn't thought about that.
That's actually that's really good. So I think that and again, I like to think at least that No Straight Lines paved the way for certain things to happen. I mean, I think it probably helped in the recent reissuing of the entire collection of women's comics by Fantagraphics. And there's been kind of talk about doing that with the Gay Comics Anthology as well series. It also allowed for queer literature to take comics seriously. So it won a Lambda Literary Award, which is the biggest kind of literary award in LGBT books, literature. And so they added a graphic novel comics category after that book.
Okay.
So that was important. And then so Alison Bechdel, with her success with Fun Home, then Houghton Mifflin bought the rights to Dykes to Watch Out For and did a big collection of that work. So made that available, because those were all just different little, collections done by different underground lesbian publishers. So that would have been very difficult to find that material.
Yeah, it was not an extensively, it was not well represented in posterity.
Yeah, but that being said, like, Howard Cruz has never gotten his due. Like, there should be a beautiful folio book-sized reprinting of Suck Rubber Baby, and it's a crime that it isn't. I actually bought some of his original pages from that book, and they're massive. They're like this big. What am I doing? What is this? So for our podcast
Huge.
audience,
It's big.
It's really fucking
Let the
big.
record show that Justin is indicating about 4 feet.
okay, thank you.
Justin's holding his arms far apart, and his arms are very long. So just
and he did like each page he spent 5 days on.
yeah.
And like full days. Like this man is a workaholic, right? So full days. And all of that texture, like all of his skin tones he did, and half the characters in the book are black. So all the skin tones he's doing with hand stippling and cross hatching.
Mm-hmm.
No zipitones. And when you get the whole thing and all that hand lettering, it's just, oh my god. And they print it like this. Like let it be shown that Justin is now doing a small little piece.
Justin's hands are roughly the size of a paperback novel.
Right. And it's a paperback novel, and then all of that hand stippling and gorgeous cross hatching looks like a little zipatone pattern, and you can't even see the handwork behind it.
And they're probably copies of copies too, because
Probably.
they haven't been properly
scanned and right, this was before that.
The original printing does not look bad.
Yeah,
I know,
the
but
Paradox
if you
Press one.
You're assuming though that they're like printing from those plates, which were probably destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah,
this
because
is pre-digital.
Because that went out of print, and then there was at least two other editions done that also went out of print, and some of those were not good. Like the paper was not the right color, and so it really just dilutes the handcraft, and it's never been. Oddly enough, the best printing job was the German edition, which was like a half again as big as any of the English editions, and it was just better printed.
Yeah,
because it's German. So if I ever got $1 million or whatever, I would do a big, beautiful folio-sized edition of Stuck River because that needs to be in print, that needs to be out in the world, and in the same way that Little Nemo Slumberland was done properly, right?
Yeah.
Someone needs to do it right because it's a masterpiece, and it's just never, So some of this reissuing and reprinting has happened, I think, with the kind of explosion now of queer comics, and then some of the kind of archival work that I was doing, but not enough.
Yeah. And can you discuss a little bit how the book tied in with the documentary? That is...
Yeah. So right after I came out with the book, a friend of mine came up to me and was like, "We should make a documentary film out of this." And I was like, "Okay," not having any idea what that would entail.
You deliberately
And
lowered your
never
already
made
deep
that.
voice and octave and said, "Okay."
Well, no, because basically I don't know how to say no to things is a big problem for me. So,
But that's also the secret to your
yeah,
success.
right, exactly. I overload myself, and then I kind of swim. If I can hang on, I'll come out of it with something. So, so basically, that was 6 years ago. I've been working on this thing for fucking 6 years. But then I worked with a couple different people, and then basically finally found. So I found this guy, Greg Sirota. I worked with him, and he's a real film person. He's an editor, and so we produced and directed a trailer, which was competent enough to kind of be of interest. And then this woman, Vivian Kleiman, came in, and she's a documentary filmmaker, Peabody Award winner as a real director and producer. So I'm producing now, and she's directing, producing. And we have a really good camera guy, Andy Black, and we basically, it's shifted, so you can't do the book, which has got like 100 creators in it. You can't really do just this history, the kind of history of queer comics, because that's going to be too dry and boring for a general film audience. What you really need to do if you're going to do a documentary like this, unless you're going full frontline, you need to build your documentary around characters, around personalities, and give them story arcs. So we picked essentially 5 creators: Howard Cruz, Alison Bechdel, Rupert Kennard, who created the first queer black characters in comics, Mary Wings, who created the first lesbian comic book, and Jennifer Camper. And we built the film around that. And gave them arcs, gave them like emotional beats, and we just came out we just finished the rough cut, so now we're going into post-production.
Good.
And so it's interesting because like it's become now about the pioneers of queer comics, and not about the entire history. It's about that kind of generation of the 70s and early 80s. That's the film.
Was part of that necessitated by the sad fact that a lot of the creators are no longer around because of the carnage of the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we lost the cartoonist to the AIDS crisis for sure, and that it's actually one of the most amazing emotional beats of the film is when Jennifer, who's this Jennifer Camper, I don't know if you know Jen, but she's one of my favorite people in the world. She's a fucking amazing woman. She created the Queers in Comics conference, which I organized with her. But she's so a big community player, a really amazing woman, and she's this kind of like just like super like just awesome butch dyke who's just like nothing, completely unflappable, right? She's just like no one's ever and she's super funny and everything. So she's kind of barreling through her stories and telling all these great stories, and then she gets to the AIDS crisis and she's like, yeah, and I, some friends of mine, started getting sick and then they started dying, and then she kind of, we were filming her as she's doing this. She's sitting in her chair and she kind of stops and kind of like it hits her, like holy shit, how many people she lost and what that meant, and she was just like, and she catches her breath and she kind of, I can't talk about this, and she gets up and she runs from the chair, and it's like, it is like fucking hits like a sledgehammer. I was in the room when it happened. I immediately burst into tears, of course, and go over to her. She's crying. We're hugging each other, and then she collects herself somewhat, walks and back down and sits back in the chair. The camera's just running the entire time. Our camera guy was great, and the sound woman as well. So she was like, so they were both like making sure that it was being recorded. The chair, the empty chair. And Jennifer sits back down. She just kind of sighs, and it's really one of the most profound moments in the film, which is great. Because that's another part of queer history we can't lose track of it. And cartoonists were dealing with this stuff and had different reactions to it. Everything from David Wojnarowicz in 7 Miles a Second, where there was just this, he wrote the book as he was dying of AIDS, and it was published posthumously. It's about him like becoming a giant, smashing the cathedral in New York City, and it's breathtaking. James Romberger and Marguerite Van Cook did the illustrations. And then other people were trying to still be humor cartoonists and still make jokes, and other people couldn't. Like, Robert Triptow talks about how he just couldn't make comics for a while because every one of his weekends was funerals. But then, also activism, like Trina Robbins and Robert Triptow and Bill Sienkiewicz did a Strip AIDS USA, which was all, activist comics and to raise money for AIDS activism. So there's different responses to it.
I actually remember that. I got that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
A teenager.
Yeah.
So, a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. Lots of responses to it. I would say that's definitely a consideration with the film, but I think also just because those pioneers are so important, they kind of started creating this movement of queer comics, and which is now like essentially kind of taken over the center of indie comics, right? And so few people kind of are giving proper homage, I think, to these people who really broke through, who kind of made it happen in the first place.
When you deal
Rebecca
with
Sugars would not exist without Howard Cruz.
As a teacher, how many of your students are aware of this kind of history going into it?
That's really very few. So, I mean, comics history gets swept under the rug, so does queer history. So certainly the confluence of queer comics history is, most people don't know much about it. But it's a problem with cartoonists, with comic book creators, is that we don't, most other art forms, practitioners of other art forms. If you're a sculptor and you go to get a degree in sculpture, or you have a practice in sculpture, you probably have read books about the history of sculpture, or you have, and that's just not true with comics. I mean, there's no textbooks. There's literally no textbooks. So when I create this history of comics class, like, I am pulling it out of my ass, or hopefully my brain. I mean, a lot of it's just me knowing people and talking to people and doing the research and just knowing the shit, being a deep geek like you guys. Like, I mean, you just know it because you've been involved in it and cared about it for so long. But there's no textbook. If you want to teach the history of French Impressionism painting, there's like 50 million textbooks. But not for comics. You either know it or you don't. So
if you want to teach the history of Japanese comics, there's stuff for that.
Yeah, though most of it's in Japanese. So this has been a problem for me reconstructing that stuff. So
to be fair, a lot of the history of Japanese comics has been written by white men with sort of shameful fetishes.
Yes, the English books, yeah, for sure. But I struggle. I always want, I'm fascinated by Tezuka. Obviously, I would argue he's the most important cartoonist ever to walk the earth. Right?
The case could be made.
Yeah. So I want to know more about him, but all we get are kind of, there's a lot of stuff about him in Japanese. Mm-hmm. We only get the kind of little, smatterings in English. yeah. So in terms of kind of figuring out people, oftentimes my students come in and they'll have one specific specialty in comics, right? So there'll be, someone will come in and know a lot about indie American comics, or they'll know a lot about superhero comics, mainstream superhero comics. Or they'll know, a lot of the women in particular will know a lot about shoujo manga. But very few have a sense of how, about global comics culture, that there's all these different kinds of comics happening in the world, and they, sometimes intersect and inspire and influence each other, sometimes don't. So that's my job, is to kind of like fill in the gaps for this body of information and knowledge. And it's very few people kind of, the weird thing is that, because right now we're trying to figure out, like, could anyone teach my class, if I have to take a semester off or whatever. And there's only a handful of comics historians in the world. And I'm not the best. Like, Paul Gravett or someone is knows a lot more than I do. But like I'm in my specific specialty of queer comics history, yeah, I'm like, an expert, but the expert, but not not beyond that. So it's such a tiny little weird field that it's not a lot of practitioners.
Do you think that that's maybe part of your mission to enable future practitioners, future teachers to have here is a baseline, here is a place to go from to teach this thing. Here is like a big picture for you.
Yes, absolutely. Because my students who come out of my class then go on and they're teaching now. I'm already seeing that happen, and they're teaching, and they are looking to what I gave to them. And that's like a weird sort of legacy. It's a really fascinating kind of mind trip, because the canon hasn't really been, it's made in different weird ways, but like it hasn't been put down in stone in the way that academia does for a lot of things, and which is good and bad, right? But I'm helping create that canon in a weird way, and that's interesting. So what I teach then becomes, is going to be taught, because this stuff is snowballing outwards, right? We're creating some of the very few MFA students with comics degrees, and then they will go and start teaching comics and making comics history at other universities and stuff, and so this stuff snowballs.
Yeah.
But and it's one of the reasons I'm so driven about, like, I make sure that marginalized voices are going to be heard, are going to be part of this canon. Like, I'm not, I'm very, very clear about that. Like, I need to make sure, because, you look at something like, remember there was that Masters of American Comics, right? There was this big show it was 10 Masters of American comic strips and 10 Masters of American comic books.
Mm-hmm. And thankfully that got past me. So who were the people who were represented?
I forget all the exact ones, but it was like, Little Nemo in Slumberland, and Dick Tracy, and Crazy Cat, and Gasoline Alley, and and then on the comic book sides, Jack Kirby, Gary Panter, oddly enough, which was weird. I thought that was a weird choice.
Super nice guy.
Yeah.
I actually found a sketch from him that I got at SPX on my computer. I was cleaning up my house, and I'm like, how the fuck do I not have this frame?
Yeah. But Art Spiegelman, there's kind of right.
Yeah.
But of those 20, not a single woman.
Yeah.
Not a single openly queer person. Not a single person of color, except for George Harriman, who is who had passed most of his life.
And he was notoriously sort of reticent about what his ethnic background actually was.
It
was years before I knew he was black.
Yeah.
And I read his work
a
lot.
I think Jaime Hernandez, might have been in it. But basically, holy shit, man, that's bullshit. And Trina Robbins did a response to it, which was basically that there were great, women creators in comic strips that were incredibly important. Rose O'Neill, who created the Cupid doll, right? She was the best paid female artist in the world during her time. She was called the Queen of Bohemia, and she studied with Rodin. Her work is gorgeous beyond belief, and the Cupid, her Cupid character became the Cupid doll, and that was the first mass-produced doll in America. If she doesn't deserve a spot in the great Masters of American Comics, who the fuck does? boot out Dick Tracy. Like, she's more important, actually. But she just
Whoa. We don't talk shit on Chester Gould in this house. And I know it's your house.
Fair enough.
This is what happens though when you have the gatekeepers who are still
Yeah.
the current gatekeepers.
Yeah, exactly.
They're like white dudes.
Right.
Like,
So
white dudes.
and whatever, the responsibility of being a sort of gatekeeper now by being a teacher, one of the few people on the planet teaching comics history. I don't know, wound up with this weird job, but in that sense, it makes me a kind of gatekeeper, and so I'm going to make sure that my students know who Rosie O'Neill is.
Yeah. So you're like a reverse gatekeeper, where like you're sort of trying to undo the work.
You're taking the gates off the hinge.
Low key bigoted gatekeepers have done before you.
But there's you can only teach so many things, right? A class can never be comprehensive because there's too many creators.
Yeah.
So like my comic strip class is only like 3 hours I get to like do work with the comic strip artist. So like who do you pick? Like I don't get to go through many people who are really, really important, but I'm going to make sure that what's her name who did Torchy's Heartbreak. It was the kind of first black woman who was syndicated, and her work is amazing. But she's also historically important because she was the first black woman syndicated comic strip artist, and it shows that that comics existed for these newspapers that were targeted towards different communities, right? Or Henry Koyama, who created essentially the first big kind of as a strip, but it was essentially a memoir graphic novel about being a Japanese American immigrant to San Francisco in 1905, and he actually details the San Francisco earthquake and what it's like to be a Japanese farmer in a white controlled town, like and then interacting with the Chinese community, and it's amazing, and like that's it was made for a Japanese American newspaper in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So my students need to know that shit existed, because there were all these different newspapers for all different kinds of communities, and a lot of them had comics, and some of them had comics that were real, never saw the light of day. I mean, Henry Koyama was never a big success like a Chester Gould, but that's important work. Like and the work was good, and it was important, and it was groundbreaking, and essentially, it was a graphic novel, 50 years before Will Eisner.
So, what is it like to be this creator and also be this academic? Because I've always seen them probably erroneously as these two very different things. Like I very much wear the creator hat. Like I'm just not at all an academic. But like, can you answer?
So partly, as I talked before about how working with students to create better, to make their comics better, has made me more interested in craft in a way that I wasn't before. Like I've always been aware that I'm deficient in craft, but kind of, the things I didn't want to think about, I didn't think about, right? But I have to think about it now with my students. So that does force me to get better. So I would say that about craft. But then in terms of, my body of knowledge, like I'm interested in comics history. So like this graphic novel I'm working on now, I have a whole section of it as a meta-narrative, as a parody of the Golden Age Wonder Woman, of the 1940s Wonder Woman, because I'm obsessed with that work, and it's the most radical thing I've ever published in America. So like,
I had no idea. You like Wonder Womans? I thought you said Wonder Womans too. You like the Wonder Womans?
The Wonder Womans. So I'm building that into my own work. That the history does get built into my own work.
Yeah. How much of your spare time is spent now doing research on this stuff for the class? Like, how much research goes into the curriculum, and I don't want to say intruding on your life as a creator.
Yeah.
But this is a massive body of knowledge that really hasn't been compiled in a single syllabus, and it sounds like the teaching of it is almost an afterthought to the compiling of the knowledge.
Yeah, the first few years that I taught this, it was so all-consuming because we have this low residency program where the students come in for the month of July, and so I'm teaching 3 hours a day. Every morning for 3 weeks.
So when you say something, earlier you said like you had to do the entire history of American strip comics in 3 hours. That was one day.
Just one day.
That is one day throughout the intensive
out of 15
month-long course. Okay.
So so those first few years, I would teach the 3 hours, which is grueling. Like to teach for 3 hours is fucking grueling. And then I would come home and I my first year, and this is lucky actually looking back, one of my students was deaf. And so because of that, I had to compile a kind of cheat sheet for her interpreters, sign language interpreters. So I had to create little images of the slides that I was using, and then little notes about them. And I was like, all right, I just distribute this to everybody, to everyone in the class, right? And thank God that I had to do that, because that became my practice then. So all of my students get these handouts that are like essentially my slideshow with all with the basic notes, because otherwise it's just too much information. Like there's no way, and there's no textbook, right? So this is kind of a pseudo textbook, ends up being. So I would come home and like I would do the lecture, and then I would come home and I would just research the rest of the day and be up all night and like get up the next morning and teach again and then come home. And I mean, it was just grueling because I was constantly refining, kind of figuring out what, and then putting that into these sheets of the lectures. But you know, obviously that got easier as I did it more and more years. But I'm always adjusting it every year. I'm adjusting it. So you know, sometimes I get mad at myself for resting on my laurels. Like sometimes I'm like, okay, I just don't want to. I don't want to redo this early history of European comics. Like I just don't want to do it. So even though I know that there's some pieces here that I should really rearrange. But like European comics, for example, I don't have enough information about people of color, queer people, and women creators as I should, because it's harder to track it down in French and in Finnish and German and. You know, and you know what I do is I go to my friends who are French and Finnish and German and say, okay, who are the women creators? Who are the openly queer creators? Who are the people of color that are immigrants? You know, and making work in these industries. So
this is your life of traveling, dovetailing into your adult career. The life in your 20s that you spent traveling, avoiding responsibility, is now directly benefiting the career you have in your 40s as a historian of international comics.
It's funny. I haven't thought of it that way, but yeah.
It's incredible that you have that network.
But there is, I mean, there's never going to be. I can never be comprehensive about it, because every country, every ethnic group, every group, cultural group or whatever has comics. Like there's comics everywhere in the world, and
it's a broadly defined medium.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can never be the expert on all of that. Like that's physically impossible. So I mean, what I have to be is a dilettante about all of this, just enough to kind of show a general shape of this to my students, and then they can, if they want a deep dive, they can do their own deep dives. But I want to show them how things are how there is this broad, comics making throughout the world, and then how and some of these intersections, right, where they start to influence each other. Like, Tezuka was influenced by Disney, and then in turn influenced Disney, right? Hergé,
actually, the cyclical nature of that relationship is fucking crazy.
It's back and forth and back. It's like intertwined like a braid.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Hergé, right, who influenced everybody. And then you had later, like you mentioned heavy metal. Heavy metal was hugely influential on the West and even in Europe, or even in Japan. Like Mobius. So Mobius's daughter is named Nausicaa after Miyazaki's great work.
And Nausicaa really undeniably influenced by Mobius.
Oh, yes,
as well,
of course, and by the American comic strips. It really, honestly, looks a little bit kind of like a Thimble Theater, like a E.C. Seeger, a bit. Like, I mean, so there's all these like interconnections happening between different artists, and I want people to kind of get at least a sense of that also.
That you don't have to be so much in your own plowing in your own.
Yeah. There's it's interesting now because so much of the cultural kind of conversation around this is around cultural appropriation and stuff like that, and like obviously cultural appropriation with a certain kind of intention of being disrespectful or obviously blackface is bad, right? We can kind of, even though blackface essentially created Mickey Mouse, right? Mickey Mouse was blackface,
Yes,
but yeah.
so blackface is bad.
But blackface is bad, right?
Just
Right,
reinforced
exactly.
your main point.
But I mean, on the other hand, I mean, culture just shifts and moves
Yeah.
organically, and you should be inspired by people from doing things in other cultures, and you don't have to know everything about that culture and be part of that culture necessarily to use those lessons, right? I mean, the Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock artists, learned concepts of perspective from Western art.
Yeah.
Then they did their own kind of codified version of it. That stuff then went to the West as, wrappings for different objects, right? That kind of came over to Europe. And then, people were looking at these wrappings and being like, holy shit, these woodblock prints are like incredible. And then, Van Gogh copied that shit, copied those compositions, and some of the Impressionists did as well. And then I think that, I think that directly led to Hergé.
Mm.
Like Hergé's clean line style, the Ligne Claire style, is absolutely, those panels look like an ukiyo-e print.
Yeah.
Like full on, right? So and then of course Hergé ends up influencing some of the manga artists. So there's a back and forth of culture. I mean, culture just it's constantly sloshing about.
That's the thing that people miss with cultural appropriation. Like cultures exchange all the time. They exchange ideas all the time.
Yeah.
Appropriation is something apart from that. Altogether.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Like
yes,
it
divorces. It's about intent a lot of
Very
times.
much so.
Yeah.
But a dialogue is something to be encouraged. And really the basis of not just comics history, but I think just thinking about the woodblock prints influencing Van Gogh, it's the history of kind of visual art.
Yeah, right.
In general, is the history of dialogue between different cultures' aesthetic traditions.
Yeah, because different cultures are figuring out different things and then teaching it to the next. I mean, the dialogue increases the knowledge of everybody. Mm-hmm. I mean, that being said, it's also interesting when culture is kind of isolated and removed, and then they develop their own specific language that has no influences, right? And so, suddenly that will kind of burst onto the scene. You're like, what? What was that? But mostly cultures do exist in connection with each other, and you certainly see that with comics, the history of comics for sure. Mm-hmm. And also, in terms of this, thinking about it as a student and as a creator, like you don't have to continually reinvent the wheel. Something what I always tell my students is like, if you want to do something really experimental and dynamic with your panel that you don't think has ever been done before, look at Tezuka, because Tezuka's tried it. So somewhere Tezuka's tried it. So just look through and like, what would happen if you turn a panel upside down? Okay, Tezuka's done it. Like, look at this shit and like learn from it. Like you don't have to reinvent. You don't have to.
Your legacy as an individual, would you rather be regarded as a creator, a teacher, or a historian? Not that they're necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
But I think just given the nature of this program,
or a super fucker.
Well, that legacy's already been tied down, my friend. I already have a plaque.
It's set in stone.
I already have a plaque in some dark alleyways. But thank you for asking. That's really interesting. That's a really interesting question. I wish it was for a cartoonist, but it won't be. And I think it's going to be for. Yeah, as teacher, either teacher, historian, I'm not sure yet, but probably teacher, just in terms of the amount of people that I already see. Like, one of my students just did genderqueer, and that book is it's already changing things. And Sam Satin it's just like they have incredible students that are doing really incredible stuff.
Oh, was Sam a student of yours?
Mm-hmm.
I actually didn't know that.
Was my TA.
Really? Oh, he's such a good dude.
Yeah, he's such a good dude. Yeah. So yeah, I think. That'll be probably my biggest legacy. Because I'm never going to be the cartoonist that, I think my work has some value and like, it'll, if I get this fucking growing, hold on. There's some people that it'll really resonate with, but I'm never going to have that kind of level of just craft and like kind of mind blowing stuff that I wish.
I don't know. I think you're underselling yourself as a cartoonist, but I also don't think it's. It is not somehow less than to have your legacy be that.
Yeah, no,
a pedagogue or a historian.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And especially having seen you work with people, work with your students, it's pretty inspiring.
Thank you.
But
I come from a family of academics. My dad, my mom, my stepfather, and I ran from the family business for most of my life. But then you find yourself a little bit more.
It turned out you were just building a network in order to go and practice the family business later on in life.
You find yourself a little bit more like your parents when you expect sometimes when you hit middle age.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, hopefully on my own terms, but but it's.
I mean, yeah, you do get to I think you do get to set your own terms, but you don't get to outrun your architecture. Like I've really had to come to terms with that. Like, because I remember when I was a kid, my parents were the old parents because they had us when they were in their late 30s, and I'm like, I'm not gonna have any kids until 41. Oh shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really funny how like these things come back around.
Yeah.
Like you can basically you make your peace with who you are.
Yeah,
I just have to make my peace with being comfortable in an armchair watching professional wrestling. That's the way in which I've turned into my father. I thought that I will be a constant font, a wellspring of ceaseless creativity, and my social life will be like unto a salon of the generation's greatest creative minds. But no, when I'm not drawing or working, I'm just fucking sitting in an armchair watching professional wrestling.
Hey man, we gotta sit in an armchair sometime.
Just like Geoff Vasile. It's a nicer armchair.
We do what we do.
Yeah.
We do what we do. I think that's actually a really good stuff.
Yeah, should we call it?
Yeah.
I think so.
All right.
Thank you.
I think
thank you. This has been really amazing.
This has been really amazing for me.
Oh.
Like, I feel really kind of inspired more than, like, I didn't think I would come away from this. Like, I was certainly looking forward to this discussion, but I'm like, actively, like, this has renewed my interest in comics, both as a reader and a creator. Talking to you for a couple hours about it. Like, your enthusiasm and knowledge of the medium is really inspiring.
Thank you.
And your optimism is disgusting.
I think I did wind up getting some of that serotonin.
That's, you hear that?
Now my dumbass has to edit this into something.
That's on you, man.
Yeah.